Hi, host Eric here, talking with famous people, and I'm going to make here in the GTM session, and I'll open up to comments or people can chat, whatever from the chat, a response to Jessica Britvec's excellent push on the Big OG Patrick argument video. She says here, Basement Overlord is saying your judgments, arguments are based off your personal perspectives, which both agree should not be subject to scrutiny. Eric is saying that there is a correct structure to your judgments, no matter what your perception is. So based off that structure, you can evaluate things outside your own perspective. Am I mistaken? If not, then the conflict here was just that he got lost in what they agreed on and couldn't find the distinction that made Eric's argument different. Maybe pointing out that distinction a little more clearly would have helped, which didn't happen here, but I've seen Eric do it plenty of times before. There wasn't a clear linear discussion about what parts of the argument you agreed on and what parts you disagreed with. Now that's directed to Patrick, I think. That now she says basement overlord, she means Patrick, OG Patrick. When Eric asked what it isn't, was probably not a good direction to go either. What it isn't is an intuition question. He probably needed you to ask him to compare what a perspective or what a feeling is, compare it to something that is already there instead of leaving it open-ended. What it isn't is too broad for someone who does not prefer intuition. It adds other ideas into the mix instead of stripping them away to find the core of the disagreement. And I responded by saying, here's the thing. I asked what it isn't, not because it's a good question, but because it distills down to the real issue. What Patrick didn't want to tell me was anything about what the matter in question was not, because that would mean the term was defined in some fashion, and I could begin to do the deductive work he wished to preclude me from doing. I don't think you've quite gotten the whole of my point, Jessica, though some of it you have. True, I'm saying each perspective has its own rules, but I'm also saying that simply because they are equal and different inherently doesn't mean we can draw conclusions about wrongness or correctness from that. For example, that a hammer has no primacy over a drill in overall quality or significance, that doesn't mean that when you use the drill to hammer nails, and I point out that's not correct, you can say, yeah, but drills and hammers are equal, so I'm still right. She says, what is the definition of a good question in this circumstance? You said you didn't ask it because it was a good question, but do you consider it a good question? The point I'm making is, in this instance, I asked it because that's what he was trying to avoid doing. So I tried to give it him as broad a possible way. Can you give me one thing that it's not? Since you were trying to avoid so badly, tell me what it is. You won't tell me what it is. I can't give you a definition of what it is that you'll say, yes, I agree with that definition. You always, like, this is something that Patrick wanted to do, and a lot of people who get pinned down want to do. They want to, I need to know where you're going with this before I give you an answer. Well, no, that's the point. That's how come we're able to actually test it, is that you need to give me an answer before you know where I'm going with it. Otherwise, it's not a good test. Otherwise, you're gaming the test to make your thing test out the way you want it to rather than actually testing it. So, okay. The point I'm trying to make about your what it isn't question is that it is one way of finding the core issue or claim. At what point do you decide Patrick is not being responsive due to not being able to defend his claim? If you ask what it isn't and he doesn't know what to tell you, should you ask specific questions as in, it is this, is it that? I did say that. I did do that. That's exactly what I said. So are you saying that blah, 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 blah? That's exactly what I did. And he kept agreeing to anything, even if it was phrased almost exactly the same thing as what he just said. It wouldn't matter, because what he doesn't want to do is be pinned down. Do you have responsibility to clarify a question to some extent if he doesn't understand it? Sure, if he expresses he doesn't understand it and actually wants clarification. I tried to do that. How do you decide that he's trying to keep you from winning the argument by blocking your thought process? Well, because if not, then it's basically like saying, if you call a foul on a player for traveling in basketball and he goes, that's not traveling, and stands there and argue about it, even though he's just walking with the ball in his arms, then I mean, how do you decide that he's trying to keep you from winning? That's trying to keep me from winning rather than playing the game fairly, right? So it begins with the burden of the person making the claim. This is what I actually said, though. It begins with the burden of the person making the claim to substantiate it, provided that the claim is challenged. Failure to do so renders it not standing or unwarranted. At least that's how it should be. I accept that people don't necessarily fulfill their burdens when they make claims. The need to do so begins when a claim is disputed. But once I dispute their claim, I need do nothing. It's unsubstantiated until they substantiate it. When I ask questions, it's to help them substantiate it as best they can, so I can see whether it's worth knocking down or affirming or whatever. So when there's avoidance in such a setting, then the claim is necessarily dead in the water. He's the one who is supposed to be proving to me his claim. I'm trying to help him work through that by questioning, going way above and beyond, since he's the one with the burden to know the things being questioned. Since, again, he's the one making the claim. If you say, oh yeah, we should use this wobbly stick to make that brick wall fall over, you need to explain how that's going to happen and why I should believe you that that's a good way to do it. So this is what Jessica says in response. She says, what requirements are there for a claim to be considered challenged? I understand that the person is responsible for their own claims, but what about the person who wants to know if they should affirm or reject it? If it's a conversation and not a formal debate, again, with this formal debate thing, all conversations use these same things, as I showed within the last video when I used this sentence. And the way someone might respond to this sentence, it uses, quote unquote, all this shit from debate. But this is descriptive. That's why I'm saying it's descriptive. It's not creative in some fashion. It's describing what exists. It doesn't create it. So this formal debate thing is a problem I keep running into. That people don't understand that what they're doing and what we do in formal debate is the same exact thing. The only difference is that in debate, we know what it is, describe it accurately, and use it correctly. Then isn't the conversation going on so the person can find out if the claim can be substantiated or not? And when the debate is formal, how are we judging if the challenger is asking questions to actually challenge the claim? I say in response, to challenge a claim is simply to call bullshit. It's up to the other person to then give any reason. From then on, it becomes a turn-based thing until substantiation either goes unanswered or the response does. If you are then asking what makes a reason legitimate, well, that's what all this discourse stuff is about. I'm asking what makes a challenge legitimate. Calling bullshit and why and how you call bullshit are two different things. I'm asking about the why and how. You can accuse something of being bullshit, but it doesn't actually mean it's bullshit. So then the outcome is having no good reasons to support the claim, unsubstantiated, but you have also no good reasons not to. Then I respond, what's the default? That's the important question. We must and do default to disbelief for any unsubstantiated and challenged claim. There's no need to legitimize a challenge. You aren't the one making the claim, you are the one offering a courtesy of believing as a default. If somebody makes a claim that tickles your bullshit dispenser, I'm late because of terrorists, or for any reason at all, you reserve the right to withdraw that courtesy. Then the question becomes, does the reason provided satisfy me? No? Now I have the burden to explain why his reason is not acceptable, and a series of claims, links, counterclaims, framework, and other ground arguments, etc. ensues. Who ends up being right is determined by how that big web of interconditional claims, warrants, and impacts calculates out. It's not a subjective matter because weak arguments end up either claiming nothing or creating contradictions that render the argument as a whole invalid when the implicit vectors are all exhausted. She says, but why must the default be disbelief? Why do you start off taking a side instead of neutral? And I respond by saying, because if it were neutral, I'd be required to prove that it was not your never before mentioned and suddenly disappeared evil identical twin who killed that family. And she says, and why should you not have to? Which is an odd thing to say. Because no one would ever be convicted of murder? It all just rests on whether or not you decide to believe them, which is outside the rules of discourse, and you can use those beliefs in a debate as long as you use the rules of discourse to include them. But what about the parts that do not follow the rules of discourse? We just ignore those? And I say, nobody's saying use the discourse to make an actual decision. Discourse is like quantum reality. We test potentialities as ideas. What we do with the results, or when we test, that's up to us. But doing the testing wrong when we do decide to test, there's no point in that at all, and deeply unfair to he or she with whom one attempts to communicate. For example, I'm responding to your actual point and we are making progress. You can see where your objections don't conflict with my actual positions and where they actually do, at least. It requires me to actually play fair, though, or no new understanding can occur. And she didn't respond to that. That's the end of the chain so far. But you can see how her basic premise, which is, but why shouldn't we default to neutral? Why do we have to default to an affirmative burden? That ultimately ends up being the true problem of communication between me and people with whom I have disputes, is they don't like the fact that there's an affirmative burden. And they want to say, well, why should we have to default to that? Why should we default to what I'm saying is false rather than what I'm saying is true, why don't we default to neutral, taking no position on it, withholding judgment? Well, that's how you withhold judgment, is to test it with assumptions. Well, let's assume that what you are meaning is this. What you're saying means this. Let's assume your sentence means this. Do we agree we're assuming that it means this? Is that what you actually mean? Well, but that's not all I mean. Okay, but do you mean this or not? If we can't pin something down, then at that point, we've not done any work. There's no reason not to think that we shouldn't use a turtle to demolish a building. You've said that we should. Okay, well, you need to prove that we should, because that sounds like bullshit to me. No, we default to neutral. I'm just as right as you are about this. No, you're making a claim. I call bullshit. Now prove it. Or don't expect us to act upon it. If you're making a claim, you're saying, I am trying to seize metaphysical ground in your consciousness. I am suggesting to you that as we move forward for this, and you're thinking about it and going forward on these demolition plans, that you consider the reality to be that we ought to use a turtle to knock down the building. Now, you're saying that's just as likely as anything else to be true. It doesn't matter whether we go through this testing mechanism or not. We should still just prefer what we want because we feel like it. Okay, well, fine. Even if that's the case, if you're going to do the testing mechanism, do it right. You don't say, I'm going to see if my kid knows math. I'm going to give him a math test. And I'm going to give him the answer key too, so he can cheat and get 100%. And then I'll know he knows math. Don't do the test at all if you're going to do that. Why bother? It's not. And a lot of people use TI reasoning for that exact purpose. They say, oh, I'm going to make a show of reasoning support for this thing that I want to be true. They're not accustomed to being detached from arguments is the reason. And that basically sums it all up, you know. It's, Jessica, I respect how well you argued that, and to the extent that you expected me to take seriously your points. So that when you said, hey, though, but do we actually need to use this discourse thing for making decisions? After all, isn't it really about who you believe at the end of the day? And isn't that kind of a combination of different factors and yada, yada, yada? It was a good point, right? So I had to agree to it. And that meant certain other things couldn't possibly be true. If I weren't responding to your actual point and considering the implications of it, you wouldn't be watching this channel because it wouldn't be reasonable enough for you. Now, you play by these rules yourself. You live by the rules, you expect others to live by them, but you don't value them because you're TE. What I'm telling you is you don't need to value them, but in instances where it's being utilized, value the purity of the thing, which is unadulterated by your TE concerns. We're testing hypotheticals. And that's one to grow on. End of video. If you like this video, you could do something super nice for me. You could remember to eat plenty of cheese. I love you.